Well, welcome to Lecture 2. We're going to recap some of the things we discussed on Tuesday and hopefully get ourselves out of antiquity and into the Middle Ages by the end of class. So much learning, so little time. And this is our learning aid, Norton von Snorton, who will be helping to demonstrate Platonic forms today using his own stylish person. Say hello, Norton. All right, so where do we leave off? Well, we were trying to, this is actually, I'm going to recap a little bit so we don't rush ahead of ourselves. We were trying to capture modernity. I mean, this bizarre phenomenon, this bizarre secular worldview where you, and you can all have completely different beliefs. Some of you might find each other's beliefs offensive, kooky, objectionable on some level. And we can agree to disagree. We can't agree to kill each other, but we can certainly have contrary opinions. And we grew up in this environment, and we tend to take it for granted, but this secular pluralism, where all you individuals can have all these different ideas, is actually, in some ways, a very unique instance of a social experiment. And one of the things it hinges on is that we divide knowledge into subjective forms of knowledge. That's the private sphere we talked about, that private autonomous realm where you decide what is going to be of most value to you, what your priority of your beliefs are going to be, magic, science, religion. That is absolutely your domain to commit your personal life to the pursuit of any of those spheres, all of those spheres, or none of those spheres. And we've divided the other, more public form of knowledge into objective knowledge, right? So this is the stuff that we're all supposed to, on some level, agree with. So objectivity is this idea created to create a sense of consensus, intersubjectivity. It's the realm, allegedly, of science, right, where we go through these empirical methods, where we use our five senses, which most people have at least five, and we use reason, and according to Locke, reason is innate, and we can therefore concur on this type of knowledge, scientific knowledge, which will govern the public domain. Again, in your private life, you can think science is totally full of bunkum. But that doesn't mean that the public realm still isn't going to be regulated by the FDA. And if you say you've got healing druidical clays and that you're going to cure cancer and you try to submit your claims to the insurance company, they're not going to refund your expenses. Why? Because that has not been certified by the FDA. And the FDA uses this objective criteria. And, I don't mean to undermine it. There's something to be said for double-blind studies and, repeat experimentation and confirming results with other results. However, even though I'm saying it's public and objective, understand, privately, we can still disagree. But publicly, that is the type of knowledge, this evidence-based, empirically driven, scientifically sanctioned knowledge that is going to oversee the public interest. So the FDA is your public agent. Now, let's give an example of how science and religion in this secular world, even though on that diagram we see one relates to the natural order, one relates to the supernatural order, therefore extricating each other from any potential conflict. Say you're sick, you have a fear of dying. Well, let the priest take care of your fear of life after death, and let your doctor take care of dying in this life. Ergo, no conflict. But what happens when you try to conflate those things again, to make them one? In Christian science, right? So that's taking these two opposing things and making them the same philosophical system again. So if you're a Christian scientist, you believe that nature's principles are founded on God's perfection. So disease is just an illusion. And that's a naturalistic philosophy. You are giving forth an interpretation of what you think the essence of nature is. Go for it. He will not kill you. Because that's not tasty enough. So, what's her notebook? Okay, so where was I? All right, so say, however, you're a Christian Scientist and you have some horrible illness and you choose to opt out of treatment. You know what? That's perfectly logical and rational, because based on your private understanding of the natural world, not the public understanding, the medically approved version, you would be undermining your faith to go see a doctor. And it is your faith in the perfection of the world that is going to heal you. No problem. You're an adult Christian Scientist. You can opt out, except if you're a minor or if you were judged to be incompetent, because you only accede to this status of the autonomous subject when you become this free-thinking individual when you are an adult, when you are self-responsible and make up your own minds. But there are many cases where parents withholding treatment from their children needs to be adjudicated, because it cannot be decided, well, do those children have a primary identity of citizens, ergo, the state has an interest in upholding their rights, their right to access the best care, right, and not have their parents, from the point of view of the state, interfere with their chances for survival, put them in dire jeopardy. Or is that the state interfering on the religious freedom of the parents? Because ultimately, these children's primary identity is not as a citizen, ergo, their constitutionally protected rights, ergo, in the interest of the FDA to approve their medical treatment. I'm so sorry, because it's such a small room, when you guys talk, I just get really distracted. Thank you so much. Somehow I can hear everything up here. Okay. So what was I saying? All right, so if you are a child, therefore, we're not clear. We say there's this boundary between science and religion, and everybody is going to stay on their side of the fence, but we see that these are things constantly in flux. Parents have to take the state to court. The state has to take parents to court, because this boundary between science and religion is actually much less stable, much more porous, much more flexible, and really much more seismic. So we're still in a process of change. Modernity may not yet have arrived. The other thing we wanted to emphasize was that one of your greatest powers in modernity is that of the consumer. It's so weird, because we thought our greatest freedom, when this country was founded, we probably thought, oh, it's going to be our political self-determination. But really, that kind of comes around every 4 years, and we sometimes sort of feel like our vote is being swamped in everybody else's vote, and there's all these interest pacts, and who knows how much we really input the outcomes of our government. Yet you know that you're going to be wearing the belt and shoes you want tomorrow, right? So in some ways, there's a huge proliferation of what are you going to eat, what are you going to wear, what are you going to read, what are you going to think, who are you going to associate with, what are you going to be? What kind of religious or magical or aspirational ideas are you going to have about what's ultimately meaningful? So when we describe this world, this modern world, and we understand that religion and science, in a way, claimed the public sphere. They're both institutionally powerful. We talked about it Tuesday. The church is a powerful institution. The science, through the establishment of universities and hospitals and government regulatory agencies like the FDA and the EPA and et cetera, very, very powerful. And yet magic, in a way, is perhaps more powerful than anything else, because on some level, It is the domain of the private sphere. And there are these rumblings, right? This increased sort of fomenting rebellion where people are turning more and more away, according to Al Gore, from the rigors of rational thought, which, face it, is reductive and restrictive and not as much fun as Oprah's The Secret. And so en masse, we have this tremendous power in the consumer realm not to go and cure our cancer through chemotherapy or radiation, but to decide that we might want to try medicinal herbs to get our chi flowing. So there's tremendous power in each of these spheres. And it is kind of extraordinary and interesting to watch the political and social ramifications of how they interact. And then we talked about how these things as separate phenomena is a modern phenomenon, driven by science's need to wall off this world from the supernatural, from the superstitious, wall it off, because science doesn't have authority over demons and the afterlife. Science has authority over nature, and if you want to control everything about nature, you've got to make sure that you don't have to share that domain. So doesn't that make sense? If you look at the world as porous to magical spirits, then maybe you should get the chemo, or maybe you should pray to Saint Ignatius. You know, you can't really have a total sphere of control unless you have this very firm boundary between the natural and the supernatural realm. And this is our vision of antiquity, where this realm, this division between these worlds, these views of nature and supernature, didn't exist yet. And there's a clue in here to understanding modernity. I think some of us would have expected, but probably less your generation, but certainly an earlier generation, and absolutely the 19th century was rife with this kind of language, the language that reason, science were going to triumph, and that all this irrationality, superstition, religion, whatever you want to call it, was going to get pushed to the sides. But that's the warfare thesis, that science and religion is incompatible. And it projects a view of modernity, a vision of the Enlightenment, that ended up not happening, right? We live in a world where all of these things preside. It is not the exclusive domain of science. And this idea of the warfare thesis is how it has often been interpreted because of the language has been so vitriolic. The language has been very much war-making, right? We have, first of all, this story as it's told in middle school. Galileo was thrown into prison. He's in house arrest until he dies, right? He's dragged before the Papal Inquisition. That doesn't sound like a very friendly taunt between science and religion. And then we get to the 19th century of the famous quote by Thomas Huxley, who says, "Extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as strangled snakes beside that of Hercules." So science is the Herculean hero. Theologians, they're the snakes of superstition that science is just going to club and get rid of. So this language has been somewhat confusing, and it has not been able to fully explain what ended up creating this world. And one of the reasons is that narrative left us all out. That narrative left the public realm, public authority, academic authority, intact, analyzed itself, explained its own triumph of reason, but forgot that the real power of secularism, right, lies often with the will of the individual, the freedom to choose. So it's a very complicated world indeed. And in summation, we need to understand this world that we're living in as really having its roots in two things: freedom of religion, Puritans, the Reformation. The importance of salvation is so critical, and it is the most critical thing in your life. You absolutely have to be responsible for it. You cannot leave it up to the state. You cannot leave it up to some intermediary church. right? It is up to you to make and to exercise your free will and salvation. So freedom of religion. That is our Reformation, our Puritan ancestry. But it's also freedom from religion, because the 18th century philosophical influences, coming from France, coming from Western Europe, also infiltrated the thinking of the individuals who sort of wove this intellectual fabric of our politics. And the thinking of those 18th century materialists and philosophers that influenced their thinking were the pre-Socratics. This is the earliest true rational system of thought. And this is one of the reasons that we have to spend a little time understanding antiquity in order to understand modernity. Because modernity, in many ways, has a lot more in common with Greco-Roman society than aspects of medievalism. So history is not progress, right? History backtracks, it borrows, it constitutes new syntheses, and the world we're living in is profoundly influenced in terms of its secularity and its rationalism by the Greek Socratics. So who are they? Pre-Socratics. Individuals living before the time of Socrates. So that's 5th century BC, ancient Greece. And they're important because of the philosophical program that they were working. We already said, we know there were already brilliant mathematicians and builders and astronomers in the ancient world. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans were already all over that. The Greeks didn't necessarily make any huge technological advances. That's not what we mean by their scientific contribution. Their scientific contribution lies in the program itself. And from what we can tell, it's the first instance historically where there was an intellectual movement expressly critical of magic, expressly critical of a world ruled by demons and strange astral interferences and recipes and spells and charms and incantations and a myriad of gods sweeping in from all over the Mediterranean. There was this group of people in the 6th century that wanted to step back and say, there's got to be other reasons why things occur in nature. Like, how about naturalistic principles? How about law-like principles governing nature? That this world is not necessarily mechanical. I'm not describing a world that is disenchanted in the way this modern world is disenchanted, where we look at matter as totally inert, no life, no spirit, but it is depersonalized. That means that projector does not have its own personality, its own secret agenda. That whatever substance that constitutes that projector is a natural substance encoded with its own regulatory principles, informing and regulating and rendering predictable the actions of the physical things in this world. So that is a potentially much more powerful stance to take vis-a-vis the world. For one thing, it's the last thing I have listed there, and it says saper aude, which was actually Kant's declaration about what the Enlightenment was really about. It was daring to know. These people swept aside mythology and tradition, stood before the world, really, with nothing but their rationality and their intellect in order to probe its mysteries and formulate a systematic analysis of cause and effect. How are they going to do this? Well, what are the instruments we as human beings have in order to discern the truth? That's why you hear so much about Greek logic. Language and thought were their instruments, and not just any ordinary sloppy language. They understood the shiftiness, the ambiguity of words. So philosophy creates a very disciplined progression of reason. It tries to exclude ambiguous reference out of it, so you always know precisely what the person is referring to. And it makes language do the bidding of reason, not diverging from that task. It will also use mathematics, and to a certain extent, it will use sensory observation. But it's very mental. It's very theoretical, because ultimately, most of these pre-Socratic philosophers, and you read Heraclitus, one of his statements was that we have to distrust the senses. The senses are for average schmo. Everybody's got 5 senses, but it takes an intellectual to have a disciplined reasoning mind, and this is going to be an elite, educated form of knowledge. So use the senses, but distrust them. And ultimately, this is going to be theoretically driven. Now, there are exceptions. We have Archimedes and his lever, and Archimedes looking at the displacement of water in a bathtub and figuring out, oh, it's volume, not mass, that displaces water. That's experimental. So it would be wrong to say, and no aspect of experimentation in the classical intellectual program. There was an aspect of that. Certainly when we jump ahead after the pre-Socratics to Aristotle, he was very much into observing the material world. But if we want to understand why all this fantastic disciplinary thought about nature never produced a technological revolution, right? They didn't end up driving automobiles in the 2nd century CE, after these things had been percolating for a while. These thoughts, in the context of early modern Europe, you drop some of these thinkers into the context of early modern Europe, and 300 years later, we have an industrial revolution. But we don't get that in pre-Socratic society. And one of the things that is interesting is that it's not Christian yet. We got 6th and 5th century BCE. It's pluralistic. It's not orthodox. They're not looking for one right way. You almost need the sort of heavy-handed orthodoxy of a Catholic Church to even shape that outlook. It's also not technologically driven. Like we said, the most important thing to these thinkers was that this was an intellectual revolution. They were wresting their minds from superstition, and that was their priority. Resting the mind, resting the self. That's why they're so important as part of our own heritage of autonomous individualism. That can also be rooted back to these guys. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But so much of who we are is going to flow from Greek philosophy. And we're going to start with one of the earliest, and probably one of the more familiar people, because we all have to learn about his Pythagorean theorem. So Pythagoras, known for a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Why is that such a big deal? It is probable that the Egyptians were already using this formula. What's interesting about it? It's a proof. This is the first time you don't just say something, you demonstrate it. Remember, we've been talking about this intersubjective, consensual knowledge that is science. Here, let me show you. Let me prove it to you. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. I'm going to present that to you in the form of a proof. This idea of demonstrative knowledge is profound, right, in terms of the public sphere, in terms of all of us getting along. And conceding to a form of public authority. But just to get back to the idea of how complicated this world of antiquity was, just because he liked to demonstrate mathematical proofs didn't mean he was what we would consider a modern-day scientist. Pythagoras was a very cryptic, esoteric thinker who believed in reincarnation, who believed that numbers were quantitative. Absolutely, that's what they did. But they were also something more profound. They were qualitative. They were constitutive, meaning numbers don't just number things. Numbers actually create things. And an idea that numbers bring forth the quality and things of this world. Well, that's a very mystical idea. And even though Pythagoras, we hear most about him and his contribution to math, really the first mathematical proof in the Western thought, we hear less about how important he's going to be to modern magic, how he influences Plato and Plotinus, and how his thinking percolates up through the Hermetic philosophy that's going to be very popular in the Renaissance period. So this Greek thought, I called it rational and mystical. They're not trying to drum God out of the universe. But this is a different God. Pythagoras' God is, in a way, his principal expression is numerical. So even though 7 might be a number, 7 is also the qualities of the universe. Maybe we're familiar, we'll say 7 is luck, or 18 is happiness in marriage. So all of these qualities of the universe have a numerical aspect of them and ultimately give birth to the universe. And even he discovered that in music, you might be listening to music and think, oh, there's nothing mathematical about that. But then Pythagoras is the one that saw the harmonic, that there's all of these harmonic ratios. If you take the string of an instrument and you measure it, and then you look at the next interval of sound between two notes, there's a proportional ratio of lengths between those two strings. So it's not just the sound that is harmonic, it's harmonic in a way that is actually numerically expressible. So he was really onto something. And then lastly, to give you a sense of how this is going to influence the thinking, not just of mathematicians and scientists, but that secret sect of magical thinkers that also flow through Western history, that the mind is the most privileged organ of apprehension. If you want to understand the nature of a cube, I could bring a cube in here and you could feel the cube and say, oh, that's interesting, all those sides are the same. You could see it and realize all of its sides are the same. But if you wanted to really understand it at its much more rarefied, divine aspect, if you wanted to transcend who you are a little bit, you would apprehend it as a formula, as cube, as c to the third power. That's its more essential nature. So there's something very idealistic about, and Pythagorean and Platonic about Western magical traditions, and we're going to clarify that a little bit as we go on. But now we're going to go to one of your readings. Heraclitus. This is just going to give you another example of what does it mean to think about nature in a scientific sort of way. Well, it doesn't seem like science to us, but the fact that he's saying, well, no, is there a least of what is small, but there is always a smaller, for it cannot find what it should cease to be by being cut. That doesn't sound like science to us, but he's actually looking at the world and going, is there an ultimate constituent piece of the world? Can you keep cutting until you can't cut down any farther? He decided no. So he's not an atomist. And he also said something else very interesting. He looked at the world as constantly in flux, that whatever the underlying principles were, that their essential nature was change. Now think about that. That's a very modern idea, to understand the dynamic nature of change rather than living in this static world. We talked a little bit about prehistorical religions, the eternal now, and sacred time, the eternal present. Well, this is an idea that understands everything is in change and in flux. So again, these pre-Socratics anticipate aspects of modern thought. Even more so, we've got Democritus, 460 to 370 BC. Now, he's particularly interesting because he's actually somewhat on the fringe in his materialism, where a lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers were content to look for a divine principle that at least wasn't pagan, or not that it wasn't pagan, that at least wasn't polytheistic, driven by emotions and temper and irrationality, and it needed to be placated with sacrifices and petitions and prayers. No, this was a world that could be ordered with a compass. However, it was still a divinely infused world. Now, Democritus, he is Actually, Leucippus is the first one to come up with the idea of atomism, but let's not be too confusing. So for our purposes, he comes up with this word atomos, which means indivisible. So he actually does say, you know, I think if you keep cutting and you keep cutting and you keep cutting, I think you do come up with the smallest particle. Now, there's a particularly fruitful idea, not only because it leads to modern science, but he was able to say all of this stuff that happens in the world, all of this change, all of this, the causality, it's really simple. It all comes about because of these random atoms in a void. Well, what makes the atoms move? He doesn't really talk about it. He leaves God out of it. It's extremely tinged, if not blatantly, atheistic. There's nothing for God to do in this universe. The atoms are at random, and things transpire because of these random collisions. Now, this is not the idea we picked up and ran with. We do not get this idea back in as a kind of a dominant paradigm. We have to wait till the 17th century, right? The dominant paradigm was going to belong to Empedocles. So Empedocles is much more probably in the mainstream of this type of thought. He is preferred by Plato and Aristotle. And Empedocles basically says, oh, he's so cute. Okay. Matter is composed of 4 elements: fire, air, water, earth. Now, depending on how you mix this, you get a different kind of creature, a different kind of substance. So we went with the elemental theory until the 1600s. So that's how potentially we can't look at history as progressive, right? Because seeds of the future lie deep in our past. And this is an idea that was going to bear the fruit of modern science. And yet it was considered, it was absolutely despised by Plato and Aristotle, who ended up being the dominant philosophers picked by the European Church to move forward. And this is just an example, just trying to understand the difference between atomism. So there's Bunny Rabbit, and he is, if you want to look at the substance of bunniness, like what his flesh is made of, it is going to be some indiscernible ratio of all of these things. And his form is actually, it's God thinking. So God thinks a thought and shapes the substance, and the substance gives rise to the bunny. The bad thing about that is, when God stops thinking about the bunny dies. And so these forms are not eternal. They're temporary. They're divine in origin, but they're temporary, and that goes for human beings too. So Empedocles, who influences Aristotle, is not going to be a good basis for, actually this, I just explained the theory of Aristotelian forms. That's going to give the church trouble. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about that. And Democritus is even more subversive because he's just got, little atoms in a void clashing together, and, there's no need of God. This is an atheistic proposal, absence of God. Now, he might be somewhere else, might be deistic, right? But God plays no role in this universe. The atoms are taking care of it all. So, implications of naturalism for us, for our world, and for the ancient Greeks. Well, if you think about physical determinism, it actually frees you from capricious gods. Right? Now, you might not be able to trump the laws of the universe. You might not be able to jump off a cliff and fly, unless, you're going to be wearing some wings or something. But, it doesn't mean you can control the force of gravity, at least prior to technology. You're still subject to these laws of nature, but you know what you can do? Sapere aude. You can dare to know. You can dare to understand these laws of nature. And then you can them. It was enough to intellectually know and understand and penetrate them. Intellectually. What modern science is going to do is it's going to try to control and manipulate them. It's going to say, I don't like just knowing about the force of gravity. I want to be able to use the force of gravity, to create forms of energy, et cetera, and to use it to be beneficial to mankind. That's one of our definitions of science that we talked about on Tuesday. So it's a different program that we have in antiquity, but at the same time, it is still full of a kind of humanism, a venturesome humanism, because daring to know is no small thing. And also, it frees you, in a way, not just from superstition, but it decouples moral causality from physical causality. So in a superstitious world where everything is sympathetic, right? If you walk under a ladder, you're going to have bad luck. If you break a mirror, you're going to have bad luck. There's all of these complex, entwined causal relations. If you feel that there's a moral and physical causality are linked, you'd think, wow, I better not skydive this afternoon because I just cheated on my test. And so God would take this opportunity to punish me. So you would be thinking, and in a way, this would create a very sort of confusing way. How would you plot your course of action? You have so many moral and physical contingencies, you'd probably end up throwing it all up and going to sacrifice to a god and let them handle it. It's kind of a disempowering point of view. But if you can dare to know cause and effect in a way that's finite, there are limited laws of the universe. You can know and understand them. And once you know and understand them, and know how to obey them, don't walk off a cliff, then you are free to do what with yourself? To morally dispose yourself as you will, to be the person you want to be. And so it creates this enormous space for new kinds of ethical philosophies and ethical systems. A sense that I can't control nature, but I can control my social reality and my political reality, because these natural laws don't, and since God does not necessarily have a stake in my moral disposition, how I conduct myself politically, that must mean, therefore, politics is not a divine realm. Politics is a sphere of human activity, and that is exactly what we get at this period. Around the same time, we get the dawning of the sort of called the Greek Golden Age, the emergence of democracy. There's various types of representative government beginning far earlier, but really it's this period where you get the broadest amount of public participation, and the culture of the agora really starts to thrive. Now, how are these things linked? Well, very specifically through these tutors called sophists. So we get our word sophisticated and sophistry, so we can see that in retrospect, these people were thought not to be so great, a kind of false knowledge. But nonetheless, in about the 5th century, you've already had an accumulation of this kind of Greek thought and wisdom and tutors and disciples of various schools. There's a proliferation of learning and thought. And now people would start getting these tutors to instruct their sons. But not everybody is going to want to ponder the nature of, displacing bathwater from a tub, right? There's going to be a practical implication for this kind of reasoned argument. Pythagoras and his demonstration of proof. And in the agora, according to the sophists, man is the measure. Man is the measure of all things. So when you're deciding to pass a city ordinance, whether or not you're going to broaden a street or, put a stop sign in your neighborhood and, ruin it for the people just driving through, God doesn't really care, okay? That is something that you need to argue out with your neighbors. So how do you do that? Well, don't worry about good or evil or right or wrong. Just worry about demonstrating that you are, in fact, right. Man is the measure. If whoever makes the best argument, right, is the person who is ultimately right and will carry the day. So this kind of philosophical outlook, it sounds sort of cynical, but really it's about human-centered knowledge. What is practical, what is effective, what is useful, right? So if that's going to be morally tinged, I suppose that's a value that we bring to it, but in a way, the secular thought was that there's certain things that the gods don't care about that are best led by human reason, and the finest examples of human thought and human demonstration are sourced in this rational thinking, and the sophists adapted this rational thought to a rhetorical program of argument, and so this style of discussion, of demonstration and proof became part of the democratic milieu of Greek society. Materialism and moral philosophy do other interesting things that are quintessential preludes to this secular world in which we live, where we're all entitled to our own moral philosophy, whether we choose to subscribe to something more theological or canonical, like I'm going to be a Catholic will be my primary morality, or you're going to be define your own philosophical program. This kind of private space, this taking responsibility for yourself, we see this happening already in the 4th and 3rd centuries in these moral philosophies. So it used to be, to make this distinction, a moral philosophy, when we had those pictures, we looked at religion as in charge of moral philosophy, but now we're looking at this burgeoning realm where thinkers are trying to understand the laws of nature and understanding that there's no necessarily link between moral cause and physical cause. God doesn't necessarily have a stake in it. So maybe I am free to decide for myself the moral priorities of my existence because I'm a creature of nature and there are natural laws, and maybe I should try to understand myself within that. And so we get thought like Epicurus. Epicurus, kind of a bit of a little bit cynical. He looked at this world. He was very much influenced by Democritus. He said, oh my gosh, it's just a bunch of atoms smashing around in a void, and I have nothing I can do about it. And, you know, I have no control over anything. There's no real God present in the world, so why should I sacrifice myself and my happiness to these notions, empty notions of piety? Epicurus, we get our word Epicureanism. Today we associate that with fine food and good living. Well, Epicurus thought, if you can't control anything, you might as well look at the one thing you can control. Let's look after your own happiness. And we have this wonderful character, Diogenes. And he's actually one of the earlier thinkers in this movement. So he's around 400 BCE. And he's a really interesting figure. He is a cynic. And his attitude also is very subversive. You can see it's these sophisticated ideas, these ideas of the sophists, that man is the measure of things. We're creating this culture. We're creating these cultural values. Well, he takes that idea and says, you know what? Your cultural morality is just a construct. It's all a sham. Why are we all dropping over ourselves to obey these stupid rules and regulations as if they have anything to do with good and evil? They have nothing to do with good and evil. They have to do with convention. So he was the first hippie. He would do things like masturbate in the agora, right? Just to show you that your little thing about not doing that in the agora is just, you know, just pretentious, stuffy convention. And so he was, but think about it, you would think that's such a modern idea. This is an idea some guy's having in 400 BC and inspiring people. So he's a turn on, tune in, drop out. He's just understands that I don't need to relate to all of this falsity. I'm going to create my own path. In fact, Alexander the Great very much admired him. And it's said to have had a conversation, Diogenes would have been very old at this point, and said, you know, after I'm done conquering India and Egypt and, you know, the rest of the known world, I think I'm just going to kick back and relax with you. And then Diogenes apparently said to him, why don't you just kick back and relax with me and spare us all the trouble? So he's called a cynic, right? And that's the origins of our word cynicism today. But in a way, it's very liberatory because it's saying that you don't have to obey not even religious taboos or the divine fears and superstitions, even cultural taboos, even social conventions and social pressures, the individual doesn't have to submit to. The individual can think his way through that. And then the Stoics are also very important to our founding fathers. Stoics, a little more optimistic. Stoics looked at the world and said, you know, there are natural laws, and we can't control them. But we can still try to create a world of harmony and order in accordance with those laws. That really sounds like the 18th century political aspirations of the Enlightenment and John Locke and natural law. So you have these. So you have the Stoics feeling that out of these natural laws can be wrested the blueprints of a better world, and that really sounds like, right, very much like the Enlightenment. And then you have the skeptics, and the skeptics are going to be really important to the scientific revolution as well, because they're saying, you know, Greek philosophers, you were very intelligent and you said a lot of intelligent things. You just forgot that none of it's probably true. So the skeptics promote an idea that science is always questioning. Science never should assert itself as knowing. Science is always provisional knowledge, always doubting itself, always questioning itself. That makes it fundamentally different than these rational philosophies we've been talking about, which are pre-modern in the sense that from top to bottom they've got it all explained. Modern science needs these skeptics to create the critical doubt, to make science both self-limiting, right? Science, remember, we put it in that circle. It self-limits to the natural world, and it also continues to doubt its own certainty. And ironically, that has made it an incredibly powerful force in the world. Okay. Now we're going to jump to early Christianity, which is the other powerful element, right, that goes into forming who we are today and defining this culture. We are both freedom from religion. That's the people we were just talking about, our Greek rationalists, who influenced the philosophers of the 18th century, but we're also freedom of religion. So this very driving Christianity gets a lot of the Reformation gets a lot of its roots, right? Its drive to go only back to the Scripture and put the faithful person in charge of his own salvation in relation only to the text. A lot of that goes back, right, to antiquity. What sources are they going to? To the early apostles, to the 2nd and 3rd century writings, and everything else after that is considered just a false accretion of the demonic Catholic Church. So, Judaism. What's different in Judaism that can help us understand aspects of Western modernity that might be unique? I mean, I hate to say anything that's so overstated, so we're going to say general statements, and always there's ways to challenge them. But certainly monotheism, right? This radical monotheism of this Jewish God. Thou shalt have no other God but me. Now that makes sense just in a practical way. If you are a ragtag pastoral people with no real land to speak of, and no perhaps even ethnic identity yet, this is an amazing thing to have this exclusive God, right? And then to make this God more powerful than anybody else's God. Suddenly your community achieves moral stature, urgent significance because you're on a mission from God, and your community now has an identity, those who are believers versus everybody else, the believer and the non-believer. That's a fundamentally, in a way, distinction possible only with monotheism. There's another feature about Judaism that's going to be important to modernity, particularly modern science. And that is that creation is good and creation is real, right? If all of this is a collective hallucination, as in the Hindu notion of Maya, then really should we, break that much of a sweat trying to understand it and manipulate it and make it better, right? I mean, this whole idea of progress and the realness of the world, and the idea that God's covenant and perfection unfolds in the material reality of the founding of a nation. It's historical. That, in a way, has given Western thought a certain materialism, very, very important to the success of the scientific program, and a sense that the world is good, and that it is good to create safety and pleasure and utility for human beings. And we already talked about moral, not material consequences, but in a way, this is also a world that made morality your primary relationship with God. So Judaism, unlike, you can say in the Hammurabi's Code, has a lot of the Ten Commandments in it, but if you read Hammurabi's Code, a lot of it is, do this or X, Y, and Z will happen to you. So it's a sort of tit for tat. You want to avoid a horrible material outcome, then observe this conventional law. And in the Ten Commandments, it's all thou shalt not do this and that. Why? Because you don't want to morally offend God. You don't want to be unethical. So its primary understanding of your relationship to God is moral. So you don't go to God for favors. Now, Jesus, we just talked about Judaism as a program for this world, shaping this community, giving them a communal identity, actually helping them to survive over millennia, which is absolutely improbable to preserve that identity. So obviously extremely effective in terms of a this-worldly program. And we'd have to look at that community-forming power and say, what were the chances that without Christianity, that European civilization was going to get off the ground? I mean, by the time you got to the 6th and 7th century, after the Roman Empire's political authority had evaporated, populations were down, agricultural productivity was in crisis, people were illiterate, they had stopped having any form of commerce, coinage just started disappearing. What kind of a civilization was going to come out of that? So to appreciate the community-forming power of ethical monotheism is an important part of our story. I mean, it really took a rather unpromising situation of Germanic tribes just fighting amongst each other and turned it into this orderly Carolingian empire. And that is the kind of focus and community that is possible with this kind of ethical monotheism. But we don't just live in this Christian world. I tried to emphasize Christianity was very much grafted onto Rome, right? Roman bureaucracy, best administrators in the world. How did you get that incredibly effective church? You didn't get it through the New Testament. That church was, the actual administrative apparatus of the church is very much a function of Roman bureaucracy. The army, right? I mean, Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor, declared himself Christian and brought many elite Roman families over to the cause of Christianity because he won a war on the Milvian Bridge. So the history of Christianity is very, very entwined politically, socially, militarily with the Roman Empire. And this blend of Latin Christianity and this German tribal culture will become our modern, our modern world, and of course, pagan antiquity. Now, when we look at God's new order, what is Jesus bringing to the scene that wasn't there? Well, first, let's just talk about pagan magic, pagan religiosity. Remember we talked a little bit about the curse tablets and the medallions and how magic in this period, we called it late syncretic period, so it was 200 BC to 200 AD. It was very driven by people wanting stuff from God, people motivated to put a curse on someone, make someone fall in love with them, get a good outcome on a business deal. And so much of the private religion was not experienced in this sort of moral, personal, spiritual way. Much of it was about this world, not about the next life, but it had a this worldly focus. You also had a certain amount of state control in religion. If they decided to make Caesar Augustus a god, you had best go to his consecration, or else, you know, you're going to find yourself in trouble with the authorities. So if there's certain state gods that need to be worshipped, you are obligated. But for the most part, it's just as pluralistic as we are today, right? It's just as pluralistic. People had their own gods, their own family gods. There was gods pouring in from all over the Roman Empire and beyond. And so it was very, very eclectic. That's bizarrely different now from Christianity, right? Bizarrely different. So now you have a god, instead of many, many gods who are helping you get ahead in this world, you have one god that's telling you to pluck out your eye and cut off your hand if these material things that make you bound to this world get in the way of your really big purpose, which is the next life. That is a radical, radical difference. You also have a sense that this is very apocalyptic. When Jesus is talking about cutting off your hand and plucking out your eye, these are not just, you know, parables. These are urgent, fiery parables. So Jesus is speaking to a world that he thinks is about to end. Whereas the Roman antiquity, that magic was about getting along to stay along and doing better and better, and it was very, very this worldly focused. And this other radical idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, which would have been just crazy kind of talk if you were an ancient Roman, very driven by things like status and consumption and what part of the Palatine Hill is your palace on. So this would not have made any sense. It's all just very odd, in fact, that this came about. And yet, again, it has to do with this community-forming power. Who were the people that were first taken by this religion? Well, it's radical egalitarianism clearly is going to be appealing to all those people that Rome left out. And by the time we get to the 1st and 2nd century CE, when we get the first apostolic missions, by the time we get to that point, there's way too many slaves in Rome, way too many dispossessed people. All those nice little Roman citizens who used to be working the farm, they now lost all their farmland because all of these people, rich with conquest, you had this super elite, this mega elite, just AIG, just coming in, buying up all the land, throwing them off their farms. And now these once proud Roman citizens were the urban poor. No land, no skills. And why pay them to do something if you can get the slaves to do it for free? So you had actually a huge social crisis that makes this religion now make a lot of sense to a lot of people. You mean the meek shall inherit the earth? And that there's an instant evaluation and brotherhood. One thing, this program of personal salvation, very interesting. It gives, and it's going to be a very important part of the Western evolution of individualism, because individuality isn't just construed for us through this sort of rationalistic program of the Greeks, which privileges your mind in a way to come about and make decisions and have authority over your own beliefs. That's really important. But individualism in Christianity is sanctified. You were all made in the image of God. That's a huge idea. I don't think we could get egalitarianism without that concept. Your soul, which doesn't actually have, it's in the image of God, your soul doesn't have a corporate identity. It trumps what class you're born into, what family you're born into, what part of the world you're born into. So this is a radical notion to treat an individual as if you could extract that individual from the social locators that tell him who he is, what he needs to be, who he can associate, how he can dress. All those things were very powerful in the ancient world. You're born into a certain family, you're born into a certain job. So in a way, this is going to also promote individuality, mobility, universality, all of these ideas we see pop up in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment defines itself as humanistic and anti-theological, but can we really understand it? Without understanding, it is also part of a broader interweaving of Greek rationalism, Greek mysticism, and Christian values. And another interesting thing about Christianity, it's important how you behave. It's also important what you believe. Now, some people might say, oh, that's going to be a lot of potential for mind control. And certainly scholars like Foucault have seen that the history of the West is about internalizing all this discipline and thought control. However, you could also say what you believe is very important, but also one of the central tenets promoted in Christianity is free will. So all of a sudden you see that this private space of conscience we've been talking about is embedded in this notion of the primacy of belief. So what's in your head? What's in your heart? You're not just a body. You're an introspective being who must be acquainted with the will of his heart in order to act according to its principles. So now we see these two things: acquainted with the will of your heart, acquainted with the reason of your mind. That's why you're such a complicated person, torn between rationality and irrationality, moral truths or practical truths, right? We're very complicated people with an incredibly complicated cultural genealogy. I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to do it. Okay, so all I'm going to say now, and by the way, there's way too many people that you do not have to memorize all of these people. It's just I'm trying to build a story, so you would just want to kind of get the story. Now, why I've got Tertullian here is because he's such a good example of an early Christian intellectual. This guy's very literate. He read all the Greek philosophers, and look, he's putting them all down. He's going, I'm a Christian. I want you to know you should not let your minds be captured by the hollow and elusive and baseless speculations of man-made teaching. Who's he talking about? Democritus, Plato, yeah, him too. So he's talking about these Greek intellectuals and these sophists who really thought that human-centered reason was so incredibly powerful that it could trump God's wisdom. But the irony is, this little excerpt is from a much longer treatise, and the way he makes his argument and presents it is all by citing the very people he's putting down. He's using their style of reasoning. Now, why this is important? It's to understand, when I said Christianity is grafted onto Roman culture, Christianity itself is actually, the New Testament is pretty small. And much of it is written by the apostles or the sayings of Jesus. The apostles probably were not literate. There's no reason to think, except for Paul, who was not one of the original fishermen, that they could read or write. Now, this was okay, and when you look in Jesus' language, it's parables, fishes and bread loaves, and it's about talking to the people. It's not about making a Pythagorean mystical diagram, right? However, how are you going to get the snotty intellectuals of the antique world who are busy having these incredibly casuitical arguments back and forth about the nature of substance? They're going to look at the New Testament and going, that was written by unwashed peasants. So Christianity becomes a world religion with tremendous intellectual and philosophical authority because it brings on board a filtered, Christianized, edited version of pagan philosophy. And we can't understand early Christianity without understanding the importance of Platonism. Now, why is Platonism going to work? Here's just Augustine of Hippo. Anybody who's Christian or particularly Catholic, he is founding father par excellence. He basically wrote the book for Christianity of the early Middle Ages, his Confessions and City of God. He is considered authoritative. And he's an intellectual, and he's writing about, first he's just sort of a profligate womanizer, wine-drinking jerk who actually really hates the Christians and thinks that they're very déclassé. And then he writes this in his Confessions, basically saying, you procured for me, he's talking to God, by means of one puffed up with the most unnatural pride. So he must have had some snotty friend who gave him a book. Certain books of the Platonists, translated from Greek into Latin, because Augustine is Latin. And therefore I read, not indeed in the very words, but to the very same purpose, enforced by many and divers reasons, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's talking about Greek logos, right? Which is the, many ways to splice it, but it's right up there with this idea of nous, this principle of logic and order in the universe. And he's finding in metaphors, these complex metaphors of the Platonists and Plato, he's finding, oh, the New Testament is saying things for poor people. But you've got to read a much more subtle and layered message into it. And if you do that, you understand, like he was thinking, that talk about the Trinity, that is just crazy mumbo jumbo. 3 in 1, what are they talking about? He's just thinking, oh, this is peasants will believe anything. But then he's thinking doctrine of forms, Plato's doctrine of forms, and thinking, I get it. I get how in an emanationist theology, well, I don't want to get too complicated. We've got 5 minutes. Maybe we should just stare at that. Long story short, let's just say Norton is going to demonstrate Platonic forms. All right, so a Platonic form, and we'll do the kind of Neoplatonic version that Augustine was actually reading about. Let's say we're always talking about the one, right? This is actually subversive. If you really think about a subversive theology, and it's actually going to be not just important to early Christianity, but it's going to fund ideas that are going to be considered heretical to Christianity, like Hermeticism, because what Augustine is reading about is Plato's adapted a doctrine of forms, and ultimately, prior to any manifestation, expression, articulation, prior to any time the stuff becoming stuff, there is, Plato called it the good. Plotinus, who Augustine is reading, called it the one. You don't need to worry about that. And this one emanates first, nous, perfectly disciplined mind as will. So it's, even in order to be an active principle, you have to separate yourself from the one, because the one is potentiality, it's everything. Once it's enacted and doing something, it is no longer pluripotential. It's kind of abstract idea. And along with this discipline of the mind as will, you get this notion of the world soul. That's nature. That's the more visceral stuff, nature bringing forth creation. And descended from that, now we start to create. And we create through a chain where the good, the one, creates things that are of lesser and lesser and lesser good. Still good, but of lesser good. So if we're looking at this dog right here, look at what I'm going to finish this, just take 2 seconds. The AKC says, the general appearance of a bulldog, medium size, smooth coat, that's all very nice, massive shoulders, and he should have stability and vigor, but also look, he should have quality, he should be equable, kind, resolute, and courageous. So those are abstract qualities. And then, this helps us understand Plato, because prior to any of these physical forms like a bulldog, even the ideal bulldog, its ideal physical form is actually derived from these abstract qualities of courage, resoluteness, love, justice. For Plato, those are not human-constructed ideas. Those are creative, real principles. His idealism makes those principles of creation in the universe. And out of those qualities, you get the thing, the ideal thing, the idea or form of a dog, and from that idea form of a bulldog, you get Norton, who is the material instance. So this material world is the least good. Now, here, it still is good, but it's the least good, because Norton is as far as you can get on the chain of emanating cause and effect and cause and creation from the one. But he's still a flawed instance. So now when we talk about all of this, we'll have to pick up on Tuesday. Wish I'd gotten farther, but there you have it. And any questions? Okay.